The town woke slowly that morning, like it didn't really want to face the day. A gray haze hung low over the rooftops, making everything look washed out and tired. The air smelled like wet stone and smoke from somewhere far away. You know that feeling when a morning just stretches, when every hour feels longer than it should? That's what it was like. Marcus moved through it almost on autopilot, but he noticed everything, every single thing. The uneven cobblestones under his feet, the distant clatter of a cart rolling over wet pavement, the smell of something frying from an early morning vendor. He took a deep breath, tasting the cool moisture, and for just a moment, he let himself exist without thinking about what came next. But it was there, that presence, patient, watching, reminding him that just noticing things, that was a responsibility now. Before I continue, please subscribe and like this video, and listen to my story till the end. Let me know which city you're listening from in the comments. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Trust me, you'll want to hear where this goes. So Marcus passed the same alley he'd crossed days before. It smelled different today, less damp, more alive somehow. He noticed things he'd normally ignore: the curve of a metal drainpipe, cracked tiles on a rooftop, a stray cat brushing against the wall before vanishing into shadow. Normally, he wouldn't have given these things a second thought, but today he cataloged every detail, their textures, their weight, their rhythm. When he emerged onto a wider street, he saw David for the first time that day. David stood at the corner near a small kiosk, just waiting, or maybe observing. Marcus froze for a second, but not because he recognized the man. He recognized what David had become: consequence, attention, the weight of something unspoken. For years, their lives had been tangled up together in obvious ways: friendship, rivalry, shared ambition, all of it. But now the intersection felt different. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about awareness, about recognizing something that had always been there but invisible. Marcus's fingers brushed against his pocket without thinking. The memory of the pendant, the ritual, the weight of the charm pressed against his thoughts like a bruise. Nothing had changed on the outside, but inside him, everything had shifted. The presence was patient but insistent, a quiet marker of alignment that wouldn't let go. David's eyes flicked to the kiosk attendant, then back to Marcus. A slight nod, barely there. Not friendship, not confrontation, not a warning, just acknowledgement. And then, like he'd decided the observation had run its course, David stepped away and disappeared into the crowd. Marcus stood there, rooted in place, for what felt like forever. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you even when no one was there? Drop a comment if you know that feeling. The day moved forward without fanfare. Marcus wandered through streets that seemed to remember him, each corner familiar but slightly different, changed by time and observation. Vendors called softly to customers, children ran along narrow sidewalks, stray dogs padded through alleys, their movements fluid and instinctive. Life just persisted around him, indifferent but rich with patterns that only awareness could reveal. He paused outside a small bakery. The smell of fresh bread curled into the street, and for a moment he thought about going in, but then he remembered that simple pleasures could become distractions if you weren't careful, so he moved on, cataloging the texture of the air, the color shifts of buildings in the soft light, the distant murmur of a radio from a passing car. Inside his mind, he kept coming back to the shrine, not the building itself, not even the ritual, but the lesson, the precision of the medicine man's words, the warning about mind and charm. The fear he'd brushed aside at first, it pressed against him with quiet persistence. Awareness, he realized, wasn't liberation, it was a responsibility that carried weight he couldn't fully understand yet. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had reached a small park near the river, one of those unnoticed spaces between streets where the world naturally slows down. The water moved steadily, reflecting clouds and light with this fluid detachment that made him feel anchored somehow. Marcus sat on a low bench and watched it, let the flow ground him. His thoughts were sharp but fragmented, memories layered over the present like transparencies. The river from childhood, days spent with David in competitive games, arguments over small injustices, laughter and resentment all tangled together. Each memory bore this subtle resonance now, like he was hearing it through consequence instead of nostalgia. The presence lingered closer, responsive to each subtle shift in his thoughts. Marcus noticed a tremor in his own hands and just let it be there, neither fighting it nor giving in to it. The rhythm of awareness required honesty, and he could feel this slow, patient pressure of observation pushing him to recognize not just events, but motives, intentions, their inevitable consequences. Meanwhile, David moved through the city at his own measured pace, avoiding his usual routes to give himself space for this emergent awareness. His mind was unusually quiet. Decisions that might once have seemed urgent now appeared trivial. He noted the texture of pavement beneath his shoes, the angle of light falling across shop windows, the faint smell of wet asphalt and cooking fires. Awareness itself had become a practice, a discipline without ceremony. What happens when David and Marcus finally confront what's been building between them? Stay with me for part 2. David stopped near the same park where Marcus had settled. The river moved in its steady current, completely indifferent to the shifts in human thought and action. David lingered on the edge, observing the water, the sky, the subtle undulations of light. He knew without thinking that Marcus was somewhere nearby, not because he'd seen him, but because the rhythm of presence carried its own signal. Marcus sensed it too, that subtle shift in the world, the gentle tightening of expectation that meant someone else was observing with equal attention. He stood, careful not to rush, and began moving along the river path. Let the motion carry him without conscious direction. David stepped forward as well. They didn't speak. There was no need. The acknowledgement had already happened in the rhythm of their awareness, the quiet synchronization of observation. Their movements mirrored each other subtly, a silent dance of recognition and distance. Time became a slow current measured in footsteps, breaths, and glances. Shadows stretched across the water, shifting with the sun's position. Birds flitted from tree to tree, their flight patterns delicate and unremarkable, yet observed with full attention. The town itself seemed to slow down, giving them space to inhabit this subtle tension that had been building for days. Marcus's mind returned to the ritual. The charm hadn't failed, but Lola's interruption had shifted its trajectory. The cost, previously abstract, now felt imminent, pressing against the edges of his consciousness with quiet insistence. He could feel it in the slight irregularity of his thoughts, the tremor in his pulse, the weight in his chest. David's thoughts mirrored a similar tension. He thought of the pendant in his drawer, untouched, the silent warning of what had been narrowly avoided. He thought of Lola, of the urgency in her movements, of the unspoken knowledge she carried that neither he nor Marcus could fully comprehend. The river path narrowed, and they found themselves closer, though neither sought proximity. They walked side by side, but not in conversation, simply acknowledging the presence of the other within the same field of awareness. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, almost lost in the murmur of water and wind. "Do you understand what this means?" David didn't answer immediately. He considered the question carefully, feeling the pull of past assumptions and present clarity. "Partially," he said finally, "and yet, understanding it fully, I don't think anyone could, not without seeing everything." Marcus nodded slowly. "Seeing everything, that's the cost, isn't it?" "Perhaps," replied David, "or maybe it's just the beginning." The sun dipped lower, touching the water with slanted light, elongating shadows across the grass. The town seemed to hold its breath, allowing them this fragile interlude between movement and consequence. "When was the last time you truly understood the weight of a decision before making it? Tell me in the comments." Marcus paused at the edge of the river, tracing the reflection of light on the water with his eyes. He could feel the tremor returning, not physical exactly, but mental, a subtle reminder that the charm, the ritual, the presence, they were still at work. Awareness had its own momentum. It didn't tire, it didn't pause for comfort. David stood beside him, silent, his attention on the same patterns, the ripples, the shifting shadows, the faint stir of leaves. But he also felt the pull of responsibility, of choice. Observation was no longer neutral. Each action, each decision carried subtle weight. The sky darkened gradually, clouds thickening, promising rain again. The air smelled of damp earth, faint smoke, and something indefinably sharp. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the tension in his chest settle fractionally. He realized that waiting was no longer enough. Observation alone had shown him the trajectory, the inevitability of consequence. Now action or conscious inaction was required. David's gaze shifted from the water to Marcus. He didn't speak. Words were insufficient, not yet. The presence lingered, patient, inexorable, not judgmental, not coercive, simply recording, observing, waiting. The town continued around them. Footsteps, distant engines, a dog barking, voices carrying over streets and rooftops. All ordinary, yet each sound and movement was filtered through the tension now inhabiting both men. A tension born of awareness, consequence, and unfinished design. Marcus finally turned slightly, facing David. The river reflected both their silhouettes, overlapping yet separate, a visual echo of the alignment and divergence that had defined their history. I think, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, that we're past the point of avoidance. David didn't respond immediately. He let the words sink into the space between them. Then he nodded once. Yes, I think we are. The first drop of rain fell, landing on the surface of the river with a soft plink. It was followed quickly by another and another, until the water's reflection rippled with hundreds of subtle interruptions. Both Marcus and David lifted their faces slightly, feeling the cold touch. The town's noises faded beneath the rhythm of rainfall, leaving only the river, the wind, and the presence pressing close. The story, patient and unyielding, continued, observation and consequence intertwined, moving inexorably forward, refusing resolution. And underneath it all, the charm, the waiting, and the alignment persisted, watching who would step first and who would be forced to follow. Can Marcus and David navigate what's coming, or will the cost be too great? Part 3 will reveal more than you expect.
The night hadn't arrived yet, but the shift was palpable. Change was moving quietly, slowly, without announcement, preparing the next layer of consequence that neither man could fully anticipate. The rain thickened as evening deepened, turning the streets into slick mirrors that reflected the dim glow of distant streetlights. Marcus walked slowly along the riverbank, letting the chill seep into his clothes, into his skin, anchoring him in the moment. He didn't hurry, but he didn't wander aimlessly either. Every step was deliberate, a quiet negotiation with the presence that pressed close, a constant reminder that observation alone wouldn't suffice. Each sound seemed amplified, the drip of water from leaves, the low rumble of distant traffic, the faint shuffle of his own footsteps. He noticed the rhythm of his breath, uneven at first, then settling into a measured cadence. Awareness, he realized, wasn't simply seeing, it was feeling, listening, inhabiting the edges of perception where ordinary life blurred into consequence. David moved through the city with equal care, taking streets he rarely used, noting small details, an old sign swinging in the wind, a cracked pavement stone, a window ajar, revealing a dimly lit interior. He didn't know why these things mattered, but he felt their significance, subtle and immediate. Something was unfolding beyond his usual perception, something persistent and patient. Marcus reached a small abandoned dock jutting into the river. The wood groaned faintly beneath his weight. He paused, listening to the water lapping against the supports. The reflections of the clouds rippled and stretched, distorted by the movement, and he watched them carefully. The memory returned unbidden, the medicine man, the warning, the weight of the pendant. He touched the edge of his wrist instinctively, remembering the metal, the charm, the ritual, and then the thought he'd resisted for days surfaced again. What if the interruption hadn't simply delayed the consequence, but transformed it into something else, something unpredictable? Across town, David slowed his pace outside a small cafe, the smell of coffee and baked bread thick in the cool evening air. He paused at the edge of the sidewalk, feeling the weight of anticipation settle over him. He didn't know if Marcus was near or if the moment had already passed, but the pull was undeniable. Awareness had created a channel that neither man could ignore, a quiet line of expectation stretching between them. Have you ever felt connected to someone even when they weren't around, like you just knew they were thinking about you too? Marcus finally settled on the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the water. The current pulled steadily, dragging fallen leaves and debris past him in slow arcs. He closed his eyes, letting the sensory details anchor him. The tremor that had begun days before was back, subtle but undeniable, a quiet reminder that the charm's influence hadn't ended, that the presence persisted. The first real thought that emerged from his mind wasn't about David or the pendant or the past. It was about choice, about responsibility, about what it meant to act when observation alone could no longer guide him. The presence pressed in, patient but insistent, and he understood, without clarity, but with certainty, that decision was imminent. David, meanwhile, entered the park bordering the river, moving toward the same stretch of water. His pace was measured, careful, each step deliberate. He didn't call out, he didn't signal, he simply moved, drawn by instinct, intuition, and the faint but insistent thread of awareness connecting him to Marcus. When their eyes met across the water, there was no surprise, only recognition, not just of each other, but of the state they'd entered, the liminal space between action and consequence, between knowledge and avoidance. The world seemed to slow around them, time stretching into a fragile, suspended rhythm. Marcus stood, adjusting his coat against the damp air. The tremor in his hands returned this time, but he didn't resist it. He understood that control was an illusion now. What mattered was acknowledgement, presence, preparation for what was to come. David approached cautiously, noting the subtle shift in Marcus's posture, the tension in his shoulders, the quiet intensity of his gaze. He sensed rather than knew the burden Marcus carried, the invisible weight of the charm, the ritual, the interrupted consequence. Neither spoke immediately. Words were insufficient. Instead, they walked along the riverbank in silence, each step deliberate, each breath measured. The water moved beside them steadily, reflecting their shadows in fractured, shifting patterns. Marcus's voice finally broke the quiet, low, steady, measured. "It's not just about the pendant anymore." David nodded, slow and deliberate. "I know. I felt it. The moment it shifted, after Lola." "Yes," Marcus said. "The interruption, it changed everything. I think the cost is starting now." David's gaze dropped to the water. "Do you mean for you?" "No," Marcus replied immediately. "For both of us. It's not isolated. Awareness spreads. Consequence extends beyond intention." They paused at a bend in the river where the water deepened and darkened. The wind picked up, rustling leaves, carrying faint smells of wet earth and smoke. Marcus's hand brushed against his coat pocket, remembering the weight of the ritual's object, its transfer, the warning. If the charm breaks, the mind breaks with it. What price will Marcus and David have to pay? Part 4 reveals the turning point. David's mind traced the same path, the pendant untouched in his drawer, the interruption by Lola, the unseen chain reaction now unfolding. He could feel the pull of something imminent, not immediate danger, but structural change, consequence, patient and unyielding, moving quietly through the lives of both men. Marcus's voice broke the silence again. We can't ignore it any longer. Observation isn't enough, not now. David nodded, the weight of understanding settling over him. Then we act together, but carefully, awareness first, action second. Marcus exhaled, a long, slow release of tension. We have to think beyond rivalry, beyond resentment. This is bigger. It always was, David said. We just didn't see it until now. A subtle tremor ran through Marcus's body again, more pronounced than before. The presence hovered close, patient, insistent. He steadied himself against the dock railing, taking in the reflection of the sky in the water, the faint shimmer of light, the soft movement of leaves. Alignment required acknowledgement, he realized, acceptance of the unseen, not just the visible. David stepped closer, matching Marcus's posture, the space between them now measured in awareness rather than distance. The evening deepened, shadows stretching long across the riverbank. A single streetlight flickered in the distance, reflecting off the water in fractured, dancing lines. Marcus's voice was low, quiet but firm. The interruption, it was not random. Someone interfered, someone aware enough to see the pattern and act. David's jaw tightened. Lola? Yes, Marcus said. Her urgency, it stopped the immediate consequence, but now it's deferred, transformed. We feel the pressure. The wind rose slightly, carrying the scent of wet soil and smoke more strongly. The first drops of a second rain fell, light and scattered, spattering on the water and the dock. Marcus lifted his face to the sky, letting the rain hit him. The tremor persisted in his hands, spreading now to his arms, subtle but unmistakable. He understood that patience alone wouldn't suffice. Observation had guided them this far. Action would guide them further. Sometimes the people who save us also change us forever. Have you experienced that? David's gaze remained fixed on Marcus. He didn't speak. Awareness had become their dialogue, movement and recognition their language. The tension of the ritual, the charm and the interrupted consequence hung between them, patient, unyielding, inevitable. The rain fell steadily now, and the reflections in the water fractured further, mirroring the unfolding complexity of consequence. The town around them remained largely unaware, its rhythm continuing, indifferent, ordinary. Marcus finally spoke, voice low but resolute. We must confront it, not because we choose to, but because waiting is part of the cost now. David nodded slowly, understanding fully. Then we step forward together. The first thunder rolled softly in the distance, the sound more felt than heard, vibrating through the air, the water, the ground. The presence pressed closer, patient but unmistakable. Marcus's eyes met David's. No words were necessary. The story, patient and relentless, continued. Alignment, consequence, and awareness had reached the point of inevitable action, and the night, patient and quiet, waited with them. The rain thickened, heavier now, drumming softly on rooftops, streets, and the surface of the river. Each drop fractured the light in its own small way, mirroring the fractures spreading through Marcus's awareness. He stood at the edge of the dock, water lapping silently beneath him, and felt the tremor in his hands extend into his arms, a slow, creeping vibration that seemed to sync with the pulse of the world around him.
David appeared moments later, as if drawn by an invisible current. He moved deliberately, careful not to step on loose boards, careful not to startle the rhythm of observation that had developed between them. His eyes scanned the river, the street, the shifting reflections of light on wet surfaces. He understood now that their lives had become extensions of consequence itself. The space between them was taut, not with aggression, not with accusation, but with recognition. Awareness had replaced conversation. Each footfall, each breath, each movement carried weight. The charm's influence, though unseen, pressed quietly, inexorably. Marcus spoke first, voice low, careful, almost lost in the steady patter of rain. "It's no longer about rivalry, David. It's about survival. Awareness, alignment, consequence, they are one now." David nodded, his gaze fixed on Marcus's eyes, tracing the tremor that still lingered. "I know. I felt it yesterday, the day after Lola. The interruption, it shifted everything. Deferred consequence doesn't mean the danger is gone. It only means it's moving differently, subtly, patiently, toward inevitability." Marcus's chest tightened. "We've been living in the spaces between action and outcome for days now. Waiting has been its own punishment. Will they find a way through, or will the cost consume them both? Stay with me for the final part."
A gust of wind rustled the leaves, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and smoke. The first flicker of lightning split the sky across the distant hills, illuminating the river in brief, harsh clarity. Marcus flinched, the tremor intensifying, but he didn't step back. He had learned to inhabit it, to let the presence guide rather than control. David took a careful step closer, noting the subtle adjustments in Marcus's posture. He didn't speak, words were unnecessary. The language had shifted into something more precise, awareness itself. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing against him, a quiet inevitability he could neither avoid nor ignore. The rain began to fall harder, hitting the dock with a sharper, more insistent rhythm. Droplets splashed onto Marcus's coat, streaming down in small rivulets. The tremor in his arms extended into his shoulders, then his torso. He steadied himself against the railing, closing his eyes briefly to center his focus. David mirrored him unconsciously, standing solid, grounded, allowing observation to inform every instinct. He knew the cost of action had increased. The charm, the ritual, they were below everything else now. "We need to decide how to proceed," Marcus said, his voice low. "Observation isn't enough. Awareness alone won't stop it from reaching us." David exhaled slowly, the sound absorbed into the rain. "I know, but every step we take now must be deliberate. One misstep and the cost could be immediate, and not just for one of us." The tremor shifted, subtle but insistent. Marcus flexed his hands, letting the vibration run through him rather than resisting. It was part of the alignment, part of the cost, and he could no longer ignore it. The charm's influence had already spread, touching thought, pulse, perception. They walked along the riverbank in silence, the rain creating a natural barrier around them, muffling sound, isolating them from the town. The river moved steadily beside them, carrying fallen leaves and debris in its slow, patient current. Each ripple seemed to echo the subtle tension building between them, a reflection of consequence itself. Marcus spoke again, voice measured, careful. "We can't allow fear to dictate our actions, but we can't underestimate the subtlety of what's been set in motion. The charm, the ritual, it's not just physical, it's mental, cognitive, psychological. It touches thought before action." David nodded, considering the statement.
which means our decisions now must account for more than immediate risk. We have to anticipate patterns, see the movements before they manifest. Awareness alone isn't enough unless we apply it to choice. Marcus felt the tremor intensify, as if the presence itself had acknowledged the alignment in their conversation. He ran a hand through his damp hair, staring down at the water's reflection. The ripple rippled with each raindrop, fracturing the image into multiple overlapping patterns. He realized then that their perception of reality itself had begun to split, past, present, and consequence folding into one another, each influencing the other subtly but insistently. David stepped closer, stopping beside Marcus. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly, not for conversation but for acknowledgement. "Yes," replied Marcus. "It's patient, it's quiet, but it's there, waiting." Tell me in the comments what you think happens next, and if you've dealt with something similar, with choices that felt too heavy to carry alone, share your story. You're not alone in this. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life, even when the cost feels impossible to bear. The first real clap of thunder rolled across the hills, distant but vibrating through their bodies. Both men flinched subtly, instinctively aware that the auditory shock was amplified by the mental tremors coursing through them. It wasn't fear exactly, but recognition of the pattern, another signal of consequence approaching. Marcus's gaze drifted upward at the storm-darkened sky. "We've delayed the inevitable once, but the interruption has changed its trajectory. It's no longer linear, it's folding back on itself, multiplying. Every decision now, every thought, it could accelerate or mitigate the outcome." David exhaled, his mind tracing possibilities. The interruption by Lola was decisive but incomplete. The charm's influence remained latent but active. Awareness had grown between them, a shared pulse of consequence that neither could escape. Marcus ran his hand down the railing, grounding himself further. "We have to move carefully, but we have to move. Waiting is no longer an option." The rain fell harder now, drumming a steady rhythm on their coats, their hair, the wooden dock beneath them. Shadows from the trees stretched long and distorted across the water, mirroring the subtle dissonance building inside them. David spoke again, voice calm but firm. "Then we step together, observation first, awareness second, action deliberate, and we accept the consequences, whatever they may be." Marcus nodded, the tremor shifting again through his body, spreading into his legs, grounding him in the physicality of the moment. "Agreed, but we need a plan, we need precision. Anything less now could unbalance everything." David considered this silently. The storm, the river, the subtle tension in the air, they all seemed to converge at that moment. "We start with what we know," he said finally. "The charm's effect, the interruption, the timing, the patterns, each step mapped carefully." Marcus inhaled deeply, letting the rain hit his face. "And then?" "Then," David said, "we let awareness guide action, not instinct, not impulse, awareness." They moved slowly down the dock, each step measured, letting the rhythm of the river and the storm set the pace. The night was coming, but not yet fully arrived. The shadows deepened, the reflections fractured further, the presence pressing quietly close, observing, recording, waiting. Marcus glanced at David. "Do you think we're ready?" he asked. David met his gaze steadily. "Ready enough, not for certainty, but for movement, and that's all we need." The first sheets of rain blurred the city lights behind them, and the river reflected their forms in rippled, fractured patterns. They were two figures aligned by awareness, bound by consequence, stepping into the threshold where observation became action.
The night deepened and the rain grew steady, falling in sheets that blurred the outlines of buildings, streets, and the river itself. Marcus and David moved along the riverbank slowly, deliberately, each footstep measured, as if the ground beneath them might betray some hidden consequence. The tremor that had begun days ago now pulsed through Marcus like a second heartbeat, persistent, quiet, impossible to ignore. He ran a hand along the wet railing, the cold wood grounding him, anchoring him to the moment. David kept his distance, but not too far. Their proximity was a delicate balance, close enough to feel the shared weight of awareness, distant enough to maintain independence of perception. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, smoke from distant fires, and the metallic tang of rain on metal. Every smell carried weight, subtle cues that heightened their attention. Marcus broke the silence first, voice low, almost swallowed by the rain. "Do you feel it? The shift?" David nodded slowly, eyes scanning the river surface, the dark water reflecting flickers of distant light in fractured, moving patterns. Yes, after Lola, after the interruption, the effect is no longer linear. It folds back on itself, subtly, unpredictably. Every thought now carries weight, every movement has consequence. Marcus shivered despite his coat, feeling the tremor spread from hands to arms, then through his torso. Waiting, observation, it's not enough anymore. We delayed it once, but the presence doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. It waits, patient, exacting. The wind picked up, rustling leaves along the bank, carrying faint whispers of the city beyond. Marcus's pulse accelerated slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, the acute awareness that the charm's influence had expanded, touching cognition itself. Not just actions, but perception, thought, judgment. The boundaries between them and the world had blurred. David spoke carefully, measured. "Then we move, but deliberately, awareness first, observation second, action last. One misstep, even slight, and the cost could be immediate or cumulative." Marcus exhaled, the cold air turning his breath into a faint mist. "I've felt it. Tremors, thoughts I didn't intend, reflections of consequence before action. It's mental, cognitive, psychological, not just physical." David glanced at Marcus, noting the subtle quiver in his shoulders, the slight stiffness in his stance. "The charm, it's more than an object, it's a vector, its influence spreads. Deferred consequence isn't cancellation, it's transformation." Marcus nodded, running a hand through his damp hair. "Exactly. We've been living in the space between outcome and awareness. Observation has guided us, but movement is required now." They paused at a bend in the river where shadows deepened and the wind carried more strongly, stirring the water into small waves that lapped against the dock. Marcus looked at the dark surface, seeing his own reflection fractured and multiplied by the wind and rain. It reminded him of the layered nature of consequence now pressing in. Past, present, and deferred action coexisted in fragile tension. David stepped closer, stopping beside him. "Do you trust your perception?" he asked, quietly, almost rhetorically. Marcus considered the question, feeling the tremor intensify through his arms. "I have to. I don't have a choice anymore. The charm, the ritual, the interruption, it's all intertwined. Awareness is our only guide." The rain fell harder now, drumming on the dock, their coats, the water. Marcus's thoughts flickered to Lola, to her urgency, to the hand that had snatched the pendant from David's wrist. Her intervention was decisive but incomplete. It had deferred consequence, altered trajectory, but it hadn't ended it. And now the invisible pressure spread, patient and relentless. David exhaled slowly, voice calm. We can't avoid it. Action is required, and that action must be precise, deliberate. A misstep will ripple outward, affecting more than either of us can predict. Marcus's chest tightened again. We delayed, we interfered, we paused, but now the charm is active, the alignment is set. It's waiting for movement. Observation alone is no longer sufficient. They began walking again, each step measured, letting the rhythm of the river and the storm dictate the pace. The world had slowed around them, but their awareness was acute, taut with anticipation. Shadows stretched, water reflected distorted images, and the presence, the unseen observer, pressured every thought, every micro-movement. Marcus finally spoke, voice low, deliberate. We need a plan, not just to act, but to counter the layers of consequence, to anticipate the pattern before it manifests fully. David nodded, eyes scanning Marcus's reflection in the water, the dark water reflecting flickers of distant light in fractured, moving patterns. Yes, we start with what we know, the charm, the ritual, the interruption, the timing, each piece mapped, each movement accounted for, then action, with awareness. Marcus's chest tightened again. We delayed, we interfered, we paused, but now the charm is active, the alignment is set, it's waiting for movement. Observation alone is no longer sufficient. They began walking again, each step measured, letting the rhythm of the river and the storm dictate the pace. The world had slowed around them, but their awareness was acute, taut with anticipation. Shadows stretched, water reflected distorted images, and the presence, the unseen observer, pressured every thought, every micro-movement. Marcus finally spoke, voice low, deliberate. We need a plan, not just to act, but to counter the layers of consequence, to anticipate the pattern before it manifests fully. David nodded, eyes scanning Marcus's reflection in the water, the dark water reflecting flickers of distant light in fractured, moving patterns. Yes, we start with what we know, the charm, the ritual, the interruption, the timing, each piece mapped, each movement accounted for, then action, with awareness. Marcus's chest tightened again. We delayed, we interfered, we paused, but now the charm is active, the alignment is set, it's waiting for movement. Observation alone is no longer sufficient. They began walking again, each step measured, letting the rhythm of the river and the storm dictate the pace. The world had slowed around them, but their awareness was acute, taut with anticipation. Shadows stretched, water reflected distorted images, and the presence, the unseen observer, pressured every thought, every micro-movement. Marcus finally spoke, voice low, deliberate. We need a plan, not just to act, but to counter the layers of consequence, to anticipate the pattern before it manifests fully. David nodded, eyes scanning Marcus's reflection in the water, the dark water reflecting flickers of distant light in fractured, moving patterns. Yes, we start with what we know, the charm, the ritual, the interruption, the timing, each piece mapped, each movement accounted for, then action, with awareness. Marcus's chest tightened again. We delayed, we interfered, we paused, but now the charm is active, the alignment is set, it's waiting for movement. Observation alone is no longer sufficient. They began walking again, each step measured, letting the rhythm of the river and the storm dictate the pace. The world had slowed around them, but their awareness was acute, taut with anticipation. Shadows stretched, water reflected distorted images, and the presence, the unseen observer, pressured every thought, every micro-movement. Marcus finally spoke, voice low, deliberate. We need a plan, not just to act, but to counter the layers of consequence, to anticipate the pattern before it manifests fully. David nodded, eyes scanning Marcus's reflection in the water, the dark water reflecting flickers of distant light in fractured, moving patterns. Yes, we start with what we know, the charm, the ritual, the interruption, the timing, each piece mapped, each movement accounted for, then action, with awareness. Marcus's chest tightened again. We delayed, we interfered, we paused, but now the charm is active, the alignment is set, it's waiting for movement. Observation alone is no longer sufficient. They began walking again, each step measured, letting the rhythm of the river and the storm dictate the pace. The world had slowed around them, but their awareness was acute, taut with anticipation. Shadows stretched, water reflected